opportunity for me to speak with all the various projects that the Egyptian Area Agency on Aging is involved in makes me very happy because, first of all, I belong to that age group. And secondly, I was raised in a family and a community that did naturally what you all have to do intentionally. And that says an awful lot about how our society has changed, and not always for the better. When we had organic, self-sustaining communities, you didn't have to wonder if there were going to be volunteers to look in on the aging and the infirm. All you had to know was, when I was a very small child, come on, child, we're going to go see Miss Haynes now. What you need? You need this? Well, we're going to go to the store and get it for you. And my father's mother, Laura Brown, walked the projects in East St. Louis, and she was over 80 years old when she moved into the projects. So for another 12 years, she was a senior volunteer. But my other grandmother didn't have to leave the house to do that. They came to her house for a little bit of this, and maybe can you help? And oh, you know, you might need this, and could you use this? I grew up watching. I grew up watching a whole community do something that in the Black community is as important as getting an education: respecting your elders. That has changed to a great extent because the elders are not in that same organic community. We do not have organic communities like we did 75 years ago. And that is something that we have to be paying attention to when we're dealing with issues of equity, justice, and inclusion. Because society has regrouped itself intentionally. We know that there is no history. I've been maintaining this and giving lectures on it quite a bit lately. When people say, well, you know, that was the past. Why are we worried about the past? Well, because it's happening every day. I can read a book like Medical Apartheid. This book is a powerful book which deals with so many issues going all the way back to the age of the colonial presence in America, and how laws were written to make sure that Blacks, Native Americans, and women, white, were not treated equally. Nor were they treated, especially not treated equally as far as health goes. But there are also other studies that talk about how women, for instance, among the Black, white, and Native cultures would interact with each other in healthcare strategies that the men had nothing to do with. That hasn't changed today either. But the issue of going back to the past and understanding that our society consciously and intentionally created programs, strategies, laws, and restrictions to make sure that healthcare would not be available to everyone equally. That goes all the way back to, I fondly call him the greatest founding father of America, Thomas Jefferson. Because when you count the fact that he had at least 6 children and 4 of them were Black, I think that calls him a founding father. He was too old to get off the mountain of Monticello and get into Charlottesville and oversee directly the building of the University of Virginia. So his sons went in, his Black sons went in and helped to organize the building of that school. And they put their fingerprints all over it. But Thomas Jefferson in 1781 wrote a massive text called Notes on the State of Virginia, answering a young person from England or France, I can't remember which now, telling them, answering a whole bunch of questions about what goes on in your country and in your region. And he is obsessed with talking about slavery and women's issues. He talks about Phyllis Wheatley, the first great published poet of the African American tradition in the 1770s. So just before he wrote his book, she had published her book, and someone sent him a copy of it. And he said, well, it's nice. She only proves that Black people can have religion, but they don't have any talent for writing poetry. Thank you, Mr. Jefferson. But then he goes on to describe the inferiority of the Black race and how they are even lower in their abilities and conditions than the Native Americans. The Indians are closer to being completely civilized because of this, and this. But the Black people, well, actually, they're so low in the chain of being that orangutans prefer those as women, because the ape can look to Black women and see some similarities. Now, Thomas Jefferson is publishing this in 1781, and then he talks about all sorts of other issues. But that was during the period where we had something across Europe and America called scientific racism, which we actually studied about in our biology classes in high school, but we didn't bring race into it. The origin of the species, Darwin running around saying who are the fittest and the survival of, that had a racial component to it because he was talking about how white men are at the top of the ladder and Black people are at the bottom of it. But you have people who did the classification of the species. The same thing was going on, but we never get told that in racial language. They didn't need to talk about it in racial language. The churches created theologies to prove that Black skin was a mark of God's punishment and inferiority. It was the mark of Cain. When Cain slew his brother, God put a curse on him. Well, actually, God said, I will protect you from anybody trying to kill you, so I'll put a mark on you that saves you. But the theologians got it wrong. They do that sometimes. And then the curse of Canaan. How Noah cursed his sons. He was the drunk laying naked in the tent. They came in there and covered him up. And the son who recognized it and brought his brothers in, he got cursed. And your children shall be the slaves of your brothers. So that's the curse of Ham, Canaan's son. That was written in order to justify taking the land that was indigenous and saying God wants us to have it. We've got this history all the way through American history. And what does it say? Well, since we're talking about medical issues, one of the things that we don't want to talk about, but it appeared in Wednesday, St. Patrick's Day, March 17th issue of USA Today, front page article on the history of sterilization of minority women. That has been going on since the 17 and 1800s in this country. Black women, brown women, Native women, forced sterilization. Women who spoke no English would not be allowed out of hospitals or sometimes jails unless they signed a form that allowed the medical establishment to sterilize them. There are a number of reasons that some people politically argue against the whole Planned Parenthood organization. I'm not going to get into that political argument, but I will have to say that the founder of it believed in eugenics. And she was a fierce supporter and colleague of President Theodore Roosevelt, who also believed that the non-white races, and that in those days included Italians, Jews, Germans, the non-white races would overwhelm the true selected majority of America. And that meant that they needed to try to teach all sorts of measures of contraception to those people in the settlements. Because if they did, there would be less non-white and more white. That is not history. That is exactly what's going on in this country today. When you see the rise of white supremacy, and when you see so many men legislating rules over the women's bodies and the restrictions on and the obligations of. These issues have been going on since America was established. That issue of controlling of health across racial lines and gender lines. Also, after you talk about healthcare disparities, intentional healthcare disparities. When you talk about the pseudo-scientific measures of racism, Immanuel Kant, one of the greatest philosophers of Europe, has a speech he gave in 1843 on anthropology, discussing the differences of the races, and talks about how Black people have thick noses because the air in Africa is thicker. Excuse me? Where do you get off with that? But he's considered one of the founders of the field of anthropology. Anthropology was studying those people to see how they measure up to us. And they never would measure up, but we're going to study them scientifically. You had doctors in this country, anthropologists in this country, sending Zora Neale Hurston was sent around Harlem to measure the skull diameters of Black people, because somehow or another the size of your skull said something about the level of your intelligence. We have another issue of scientific racism that nobody ever wants to talk about, but it is still present. When I had my second vaccination shot a few days ago, I had to fill out this little form, and it said, what is your ethnic or racial background? I looked, there were 2 lines for it, and I said, Black African American. And the woman who read it over, just to see that she said, well, now are you Hispanic or not Hispanic? I said, but I filled out Black. She said, oh no, you have to do that one too. Now, the last time I checked, the language that you speak is not a racial identity. And also, I know from my studies and all the scholarship that's been done, that most of the people we call Mexican are a blend of African and indigenous people. They may have been forced to learn Spanish for survival, but that doesn't give them an ethnic racial identity. But we have that on the census, Hispanic. Well, does that mean the Afro-Cubans, the Afro-Puerto Ricans, the African Mexicans are all the same culture? They don't think so. So why are we imposing categories of existence on people, especially when all of those categories mean that you are different or other? Now, where does that come from? There's a very famous principle in American law, the 1-drop rule, that somehow the composition of your blood will tell us what your racial identity is. And it was in law that if you had any Black ancestors in your Ancestry.com page, if you had any Black ancestors, that legally made you Black, which legally made you inferior. Now, if you don't think that has something to do in how healthcare was manifested and shared, then we're all being deliberately in denial of the truth. I can think of so many instances where people, well, as a matter of fact, just within the last week, there was a judge who forced into mediation the National Football League's administration and a number of Black football players who were denied full coverage for healthcare issues because doctors had studied them and said, well, since Black people feel pain differently than white people, we don't have to give them full coverage like we would our white football veterans. Excuse me. I know that could not possibly have been a policy, and it was. And again, that's not going back to doing medical experimentation on slaves' bodies and black women's bodies because a doctor says, well, black people don't feel pain the same way white people do. So we can do medical experiments on these black women and without any anesthesia whatsoever. That's been part, and the person who did that, they just took his statue out of Central Park in the last 5 years. He was declared a hero. This goes all the way through our education, but they don't put gender or racial terms with it, so we just hear it and it blows right through our ears. The one drop rule is operative on our United States Census. We design ethnic categories and gender categories that fit the dominant narrative, but don't necessarily fit the truth of the people being labeled and defined, categorized, or segregated. When I was a student in my theology classes at St. Louis University, a psychologist who was part of the advisory council for the Catholic Hospital Association came and talked to a seminar that I was in, and he told us, this man was not making up fake news. He told us that there was a policy in the healthcare system that quite often women who were pregnant and went into the hospital might have diabetes discovered. That is a fact of pregnancy that I know firsthand. My oldest sister, pregnant with her second child, diabetes. That second child's wife, years later, pregnant, diagnosed with diabetes. Well, this consultant for the Catholic Hospital Association told us in 1972 that there was a policy that those women might not be told that they had diabetes, so that the disease would eventually die out. That is no different from the Tuskegee experiment on black men when they had syphilis and were never told they had it, so that they could be studied as a laboratory animal until they died. And up until about 10 years ago, the federal government was still paying their descendants for that kind of wrongful treatment. We have got these disparities everywhere. So now we get to the question of how do we exercise our brains to discover ways that we can implement equity? Well, we can never implement equity if we don't study history, because you don't really know what you're trying to restore or make better or change. But America in our education culture doesn't want to study history. Well, that was the past. Let's just figure out what's going on now. Wait. That's why we have lawyers, to go back and undo some of the badness of the past and make it goodness for today. So for equity issues, there are 3 or 4 different points that I would like to make, which some of us in this audience, in this discussion, already manifest. Believe that people tell you the truth. That's a major issue. Believe that people tell you the truth and let them trust you by letting them know that if they tell you the truth, you will accept and hold on to it, no matter how uncomfortable it is, because being able to tell the truth about my condition is part of my healing, mental and physical, because suppressing the truth is traumatic stress disorder. And if you know that people have been abused physically, mentally, and every other way from birth for the last 450 years of being Black in America, or having to give up your land because somebody else took it from you, or being denied an opportunity to live where you should be living, or to flee from oppression that you have paid for. If we don't want to believe this, then we're going to keep in helping strengthen traumatic stress. Personal story. When I was 5 years old, these two teenage girls raped me. I didn't know what to say about it. You're 5 years old. So I never said anything to anybody until I was in therapy in my 20s. But when I was 7 years old, my brother was, as they would now politely say, inappropriate with my body. And I couldn't say anything about that either because I knew how much my brother had suffered when he was 13 years old and had polio, and he was my light, and I loved him to death, and I wasn't going to say anything to my parents because I didn't know how to say it. So I never said anything. But when I was 7 years old, I started having migraine headaches. Stuff I couldn't think about. That was based on stuff I couldn't talk about. So how many people are we going to be working with who are just going to sit there and be quiet? Not because they don't have something to say, but because they have spent a lifetime knowing that talking about it is not going to be taken seriously. So when I would get very, very sick, my father would say, you ain't that sick. When I was 12 years old and in an all-white school except for me and my little sister in Wisconsin, and I had a sudden migraine attack, and I put my head down on the desk, and the nun who was teaching us walked by and hit me in my head with that ring finger. Sit up straight. Sister, I have a headache. Oh, you're 12 years old, you don't have headaches. Well, the next day when my older sister came to school to have an intervention with that nun, she changed her mind. That's all I'm going to say about that. But she never hit me again. I don't think she ever raised that ring hand to anybody. And well, she shouldn't have. But why would it take that? If a 12-year-old says, I don't feel well, oh, he's not that. So when that person is 82 years old, they've had a history of not telling exactly how bad they feel. And here we are supposed to be working for their benefit. Female, that same older sister, she wound up with such bad arthritis that they had to do a replacement of this part of her arm. She had other medical issues, the diabetes. The doctor that she was going to in East St. Louis turned her into an opioid junkie where she can remember what pills she took sometimes during the day, and she would float through the house. My father was upset, my mother was upset, and her two children were upset. And he was also inappropriately involved with her outside of his medical profession. And he just kept pumping pills into her. She gets worse and worse and worse. My mother finally got her to agree to going to a different doctor. There was a medical emergency when my mother drove me to the airport so I could go back to where I was living at the time. And on the way back home, my sister had another major episode. She had to get her into the emergency room. And the doctor that she had been transferred to was not on that staff. So the nurses gave her the doctor that she used to have. I flew back the next day because my mother had lost it. And I walked in there and said, I called the doctor, this new doctor. He said, well, y'all need to make your minds up. Who do you really want to be doing all this? Blah, 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 blah. And I said, excuse me. And I used the best tone of voice that I could possibly use. And he said, oh, well, in that case, we'll have her transferred to St. Elizabeth's Hospital immediately. I'll get all that arranged. And thank you, sir. I said, fine. So I went to the hospital, and one of the nurses came up to me in the hallway and said, can I talk to you? Thank you, because that man's been trying to kill her. Thank you. Now, the problem was also that she was unable to work anymore, 50 years old. And she applied for Social Security disability payments. This was during the Reagan era. And for some reason, up there in East St. Louis, they transferred her file to some physician here in Southern Illinois who looked it over, never met her, and said she's capable of work. Request denied. She had to go into pro bono legal work for over 2 years before she was restored to Social Security disability. And she told me, Joseph, I'm so tired of fighting. And a year later, she was dead. I know what disparities mean, and I know what equity must do. First thing is believe people's stories. Let them know that you trust and respect them, and they will start to trust and respect you by how you behave. The next thing we have to do is to realize that no matter how much you work for them, you're also working against a larger system that would prefer that you not. The third thing you have to do is to realize what you can't do. And always be honest. I can do this, but I can't do that. Because quite often somebody's going to say, well, thank you, because at least you tried. But that's going to take some steps. The other thing that we really need to think about is how the medical professions in this country were designed by people who thought that disparities of healthcare were perfectly justified based on their readings of Black, brown, native, and female populations. And that's the majority of the problem we have today. That we have to have proactive, challenging education within the healthcare system. Those of us who are out on the front lines dealing with these people morning, noon, and night, be it in the hospital, at their homes, or in the parking lots, we know that we also have to fight 2 or 3 battles. Tell the truth about that. Because sometimes when somebody's fighting on my behalf over there and I hear about it, that gives me so much hope for me to start fighting for myself. Don't be ashamed of what you can't do. And don't feel guilty about what you can do. Just do it. As I have said already, I grew up in a neighborhood, in a community where people took care of each other. They just knew, and nobody was embarrassed. And that's so much of a problem. I don't know you, so I can't tell you. Well, I don't have all day. I can just do, wait a minute. If I've been carrying this constriction of self for 65 years, how much time is it going to take for you to help me unlock it or dissolve it? That's the question, because we all live on deadlines. But that ain't how I had to live. And here's probably the last thing I really want to say before we open things up for discussion. Telling the story is always therapeutic. Think about Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, any of those anonymouses. Tell us your story. Think about far too many TV shows. I mean, how did Oprah get to be an almost billionaire? I wonder. Anyway, by getting people to tell their stories. And the therapy of that kind of a dynamic in the media, she is respected because the story that I just heard on TV sounds like my story. I feel better because I'm not by myself and alone. There are so many ways to have people sit down and start to feel like I do matter. I have said this quite often. Little children, the grandchildren, are key to so much therapy for the elderly because the children can ask, Papa, what happened? Watch blah, 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 blah. Well, I'll tell you. Whereas their daddy would say, Pop, did you ever go through? I don't want to talk about it. I ain't going to talk about it. And the same thing is true for the woman in the kitchen. Oh, baby, let me show you. And while we in here doing all this, my mother used to do this and blah, 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 blah. And a little 8, 9, 10-year-old is just in there absorbing it. Wire them. Put them into the position of get them to tell you their stories. There are so many different ways. Now, talking about equity and discrimination, we know what that means. If they haven't ever had a chance, we have to say you are now our priority. That's what it means. You never had a chance and now you are my priority. And you know what that comes down to? Loving people. Because America will not survive unless we find ways to love one another. And whenever we see someone who is being abused, we have to speak up. Be it at the border, a 9-year-old child, or a 4-year-old in the back seat of a car where their daddy gets shot by the police, or somebody sitting in a nursing home who hasn't had a bath in 5 days. How are you loving this person? That's what we were taught when we were 6, 7, 8 months old in our houses. So why have we gotten rid of that when we go to work? I thank you all for inviting me here.